Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Over the past two episodes, we've been working our way through a conversation I had in 2021 with one of my Northern Seminary professors, Jacob Robinson, about Raj Patel's New York Times bestselling book, The Value of Nothing: How to Reshape Market Society and Redefine Democracy. In episode 149, we discussed how economic and religious power commodifies people. Then in episode 150, we talked about how our lack of self-awareness leads to competition and retribution. As I pointed out in the first of these three episodes, I wanted to share this conversation because we're in a season of crisis in our democracy. As the authoritarian right continues its assault on democracy, many in the middle or on the left are coming to democracy's defense. And yet, in our experience of democracy, there are a lot of embedded assumptions about the way economic and religious power works that lead to the dehumanization of others that we may not be aware of. So it's important for us to reflect on what a healthy democracy could look like and how an unhealthy democracy may be harming our neighbors. In today's episode, we're going to get into how competition fuels the control and devaluing of women. And as I mentioned in the first episode, this three-part conversation is only covering the first half of Patel's book. We'll get into the second half of Patel's book in future episodes, but I'll plan on taking a break from the series and getting back to doing some other interviews and covering the news before we revisit the series again. So here is the conclusion of my first conversation about economics and religion with Jacob Robinson. So on page 30, he says, in other words, a good predictor of cooperating well in these sorts of games is having been involved in exchange and money in other contexts. This is an important clue. Exchange itself might not be the source of the problem in explaining our current economic crisis. The problem lies in the system that surrounds the act of exchange. So I often hear conservatives, and especially conservative Christians, denying the existence of systemic evil. And so I'm just curious, what are you seeing here regarding the source of our problem being at a systemic level?
Yeah, so I thought this was really fascinating because the study was sort of asking what happens when people who don't know each other, and especially come from different demographics, are expected to cooperate. And what it showed was that people who didn't know each other didn't cooperate. And people who didn't know each other cooperated more. And I guess that pretty much makes sense, especially when you start throwing in various demographics, whether it's race, ethnicity, language, gender, those sort of things. And so there's this aspect that the system actually perpetuates this, not because the exchange isn't possible, but because the system itself creates the separation which prevents the cooperation. If you're for race studies, I mean, this is why segregation back in the early 20th century, and then now in what we call separation, it's now voluntary, it's not legal like it was, but it's still practiced. And the whole idea is when you have a system that's based on segregation and separation, people don't cooperate across lines. It just creates all these different sort of tribalistic views. And the people who could actually benefit from sharing of resources, sharing of ideas, working together for a greater cause, can't and don't, because the system itself is one that institutes separation. And so when I read this, I was like, man, yeah, the problem is that the system forces separation, but that also means the solution is really simple. We need to initiate new relationships. And when you actually initiate new relationships across these lines, whether it be race, class, gender, ethnicity, language, religion, when you actually initiate these relationships, cooperation becomes much easier. But we are so stuck by this system of separation that we don't even see the potential of collaboration. And so it is one of those things where the system, it works, but it is it's permeable. It can be changed by just people saying, no, I don't have to remain separated. I can actually take the initiative and start relationships and cooperating with people who are different than myself. And man, I wonder how different the church would look if we actually took that seriously. If we didn't buy into this sort of like market competitive sort of mindset that groups are competing with each other, and opposed, like, no, we're actually should be cooperating instead of competing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like I did my undergrad at Bob Jones University, and like we were taught that God is holy, and holy means to be set apart. And so we are fundamentally separated from God. And so then it's like they would then look at human relationships in terms of separation. And so historically, like Bob Jones didn't allow interracial dating until 2000, when, again, getting into the political world, George W. Bush went and campaigned there. The media, noticed this. Why are you speaking to the school that won't allow Black and white people to date? And then, all of a sudden the school changed their mind on this. And they had this like theology going all the way back to Babel on this and everything. And so it's like the Tower of Babel. And so it's like, but now like they want us to act like, okay, we've settled our racial issues, but they've got all of these other things, like especially like women are separated into these roles. And, it's like, and so they still use the same, like the created order is something that they talk about, of how everybody needs to be separated. And it's like, well, you're using the same exact argumentation of separation that you used during segregation. So how are we supposed to now trust that you have wisdom here in this situation and you're not actually doing the same exact thing?
Yeah. And it's interesting is that's not even just religious. It's also just this ideology that has sort of permeated a lot of sort of white Eurocentric culture that was very evident in colonialism and various other things. And so, so to sort of transition to the next quote, since we were talking about women, I thought this one was really fascinating. This is on page 67. The cheaper it is for workers to survive and reproduce, the better for profits. While it is beyond the means of any single capitalist to lower the price of labor power collectively, as we shall see, to reproduce workers requires more than making babies. It's a long process of childbearing, feeding, clothing, housing, educating, socializing, and disciplining. And the costs of this are the source of perhaps the most fundamental misvaluation worldwide: the market's treatment of women's work in the home. The daily work of rearing children, maintaining a household, and engaging in civic work, the unpaid slabs of work that feminists have called women's triple burden, remains unpriced worldwide. So this isn't just something that has gone noticed regarding the exclusion of women. It is also part of what has been their social, political, and economic degradation as well. Essentially claiming women's labor isn't worth anything. It is of no value, yet it becomes the essential sustainer of society, that without the rearing of children, their society doesn't perpetuate. So I find it really ironic and tragic that our market economy and culture has essentially degraded women, saying their work is not of value. I know this is obviously relevant for you, in your current positions.
So yeah, it's interesting. Like I never thought about getting to the quote, thinking about babies in terms of like reproducing workers. Like in a capitalistic system, that's what you're doing. You're creating future workers for this market system. And so it's just interesting, like we have these stay-at-home parents who are raising and training the workers of the future, and yet they don't get paid for this at all. And overwhelmingly, this is where our society has placed women. And so as a stay-at-home dad, I'm starting to see the challenges that a lot of women face. And it's a role that this is the role that they're put in, the role they have to play. I think, again, getting back to complementarianism, it tells you this is a role you have to play. And it's kind of funny, like for me, because like all the books or articles that I read about being a stay-at-home parent or about homeschooling, because we homeschool our kids, they're all like written to women. And especially the Christian resources, they're all about being a complementarian biblical woman. So I'm like, for me to learn practical advice from people who know about what I do, I'm learning about how to be a biblical woman, which I'm not even a complementarian. So it's just kind of funny. But I think it really gets like to this whole, like, what is your lens of value? Like when you think of it in terms of like, an individual job, I hear people all the time say, well, stay-at-home moms, like they don't deserve any money. They're not working for it. They don't have a boss. They made this decision. They're not producing anything. But like, if you just back up and have your lens be at this like social level, the national level, you can begin to see like these women are like fueling our future. Like, how does that not have value? And I think that's one of the things that this book brings out a lot is this concept of value. You miss out on where the true value lies, and you don't see the effects of the damage and the extent of the damage that it causes when all you're thinking about is, in this moment, my bottom line, my profit margins. You just miss out on a lot of that.
Yeah, and I think you hit a really important point there, in that we've been trained to think so myopically, that our field of vision is so narrow and so shallow. Like, we have not been trained to see the big picture. We've been trained in a world of immediate gratification, and also this idea that we have to keep progressing in purchasing. It's like, yeah, the whole keeping up with the Joneses thing is like, we're less of a human if we don't keep buying stuff. And I'm like, where did we learn that? But yet it so permeates our understanding. And so when there is stuff that isn't actually purchased, like, well, raising kids, even though you have to purchase a lot of things to raise kids, it's, they don't even know how to evaluate it. And I'm like, man, we've lost the whole idea that like parenting and friendships like no longer have value, and it's tragic.
Yeah. And we don't even have, and I think part of that is we don't value the togetherness that our nation has. Like, we are producing an economy together. And when we don't have that togetherness mindset, we think, I've got my job and I shouldn't have to pay for somebody else to raise their kids. But when we have this togetherness mindset, well, maybe we need to ask some questions about what value they're playing in our future. And maybe we need to work to support that in some ways that we wouldn't in that individualist mindset. So speaking of our desires and everything, going on to page 87 and 88, he's talking about this concept that Hobbes presented of humans being inherently machines of infinite want. But then he counters that with Rousseau by saying, it was possible, Rousseau argued, for people to feel that they've got enough. Being sated is something that people can learn, and it is after they have managed to control their instincts and impulses in the best interests of themselves and a society that they are truly free. So I'm just wondering if you could speak into this concept of freedom coming when we can manage to control our instincts and impulses in the best interest of ourselves and our society.
Yeah, this one, for some people in a market economy, this actually may sound contradictory or even counterintuitive. Because when the whole idea is, when getting more is the ultimate goal, like, yeah, that's just what you do. But it's interesting is that it's only when you break free from that impulse to need more that you actually are free sort of not to. When you actually can sort of get out of that, the whole system, the whole worldview of purchasing and more is better, and like all of a sudden there's a freedom that comes from that. I remember in my early 20s, I read a book called The Freedom of Simplicity, and it absolutely transformed the way I understood how I wanted to be in the world. And Richard Foster, the author, he wrote, "We only have so much energy to give. And whether you like it or not, your stuff requires energy. And when you are investing your energy in stuff, you aren't actually investing it in people." And so the freedom of simplicity comes when you can come to that point and say, I have enough. I don't need more. Because the more I get, the less energy I have to give to my loved ones, the less energy I have to give to the people I care about. And so I think there is this true, actually going back to sort of like the greatest, or the second commandment of loving your neighbor as yourself. I think this is directly related to that you can actually love yourself by not loving stuff. And by not loving stuff, it actually enables you to love your neighbor. It doesn't say love your stuff as you love yourself. It says love your neighbor as you love yourself. But I think our market economy has spun that so much where we really do believe that we're supposed to love our stuff. And I'm like, really? Is that what this earthly life is about? But it does take this mental shift of breaking out of that and really just sort of feeling, nope, I got enough. I don't need more. I don't need a new TV that's 4 inches bigger and maybe a little clearer. I'm not less of a person because my TV isn't as big as my neighbor's. That means nothing. But so I think it's interesting to when you break out of the market economy, it can actually transform relationships.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. Like, I often criticize the fundamentalist past that I had, but I also find myself seeing like conversations that were had there where there was like these seeds of wisdom. Like, when I graduated, one of the big things was like alcohol, like, oh, suddenly I can drink beer now, and so like, there was like, I'm free to drink beer, Romans 14, and all this kind of stuff. You can't judge me. And I remember one time my mom said to me, she said, well, I feel like I'm free not to. And it just seemed dumb to me. Like, well, come on, like it's so good, and but like I think in a sense there's some truth there. Like, freedom isn't the ability to just go out and do whatever the heck you want. Like, freedom is the ability to enjoy a beer and the ability to not enjoy a beer. I think the market system is functions very much like an alcoholic in many ways, in an addiction, unhealthy addiction. But
I also think it's helpful to recognize that reacting to something isn't freedom from it. Like, when you react to something, it still has a sense of control over you because you reacted to it. Like, there's still this bond that it controls you in some capacity when you react to it. It's when you disarm its effect on you is actually where the freedom comes. So in some ways, your mom was absolutely right. That the freedom, like when you're reacting against this rule, you're still empowering the rule by reacting to it. And it's only when you're like, well, I can choose either option and that's fine, that you actually disarm the structure and the system. And so I do think and that's where it's tricky, right? And especially when it comes to systems. And that's why some people push for revolutions. They're like, no, the system can't be fixed. And other people are like, no, let's try to fix it, make it better. They're more reform. And then other people are just totally assimilationists. But yeah, and I don't have clean answers on which is the best way to approach these systems, whether they're economic or governmental or religious. Some days I'm more revolutionary, some days I'm more reform. I try not to be assimilationist, but I also am completely honest that I'm complicit in the system because I participate in it. And so it's really interesting when you start looking at these, the idea of what is my freedom, within these, and how can I actually truly exercise freedom.
Yeah. And how much of our systems, like going to those first things we talked about that we assume are just basic reality, like whether it's political or whether it's theological, how many of those were developed as reactions to something that came before? They weren't just there from all time. Like, they developed as in reactions to something else. And I think it's important to become aware of that. And I think that's why, maybe studying church history can be kind of boring to people, or studying political economic history could be boring. But becoming aware of that, you can start to see the context of how these reacted to what came before, how they were handed down by power. And then you can dismantle that power then in that awareness. So I think we had one final question.
Yeah. So I thought this one was interesting. There was actually a thought analysis that was done. They asked the question, if the corporation, so like the corporation being, well, any big corporation, were a person, what sort of person would it be? And I thought this would be fascinating to ask the same question regarding the church. If the church, what were a person, what kind of person would it be? Would it be a narcissist? Would it be loving and kind? Would it be generous? Would it be greedy? Would it be self-serving? So in your observation, if you had to just like take a big picture sort of like view of the church and say, what kind of person would the church be? How would you describe it?
So I actually, when I wrote an answer down, but I was thinking of a corporation. I was not at all thinking about a church. But reading this in the context of a corporation and thinking about it as a church is kind of funny. I said it would be like a sinister 5-year-old kid with full access to my bank account, no true understanding of value, and no regard for risk or future consequences. I was referring to a corporation, but I think a lot of that could be applied to a church. I can maybe come up with a better answer if I thought from scratch for a church, but it's kind of funny to think of the parallels there.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, I mean, I sort of changed the question on you a little bit, so apologize for the out of the blue sort of question. But I don't think it's wrong when you actually sort of see how the church has functioned. There are times the church is loving and kind and generous and selfless. And then there's other times where it is completely sort of self-centered and a power monger and greedy and deceptive. And yeah. And so I think in some ways, I don't think you can have a single picture of the church because it is so diverse all over the place. But then it also makes me wonder, is that a problem? Is that one of the reasons why, less and less people are becoming Christians this day? Because look at it, what is it? They don't even know what it is. Is it this corporate marketing sort of like principled sort of thing, or is it actually people trying to be selfless and kind? But yeah, so I think it is interesting to ask if we were to take a big picture, and then it also be interesting. I think it would be a fascinating question to ask if you ask people in the church what they thought, how they would answer this, like what kind of person would the church be, and if you ask somebody outside the church how they would answer this question, and then I think that'd be fascinating.
And something too, like as I've gotten to know other people who have been deconstructing, like I grew up with this very us versus them mentality, where people in different denominations, they were the them. There was actually a cassette tape I had from Bob Jones called Us Versus Them. And the preacher was like, we are us and they are them. And, but like when in this deconstruction conversation, as I've met others who have rethought this stuff, like I'm starting to realize like they, in their context that we thought they were them, they had a lot of the same issues that we were dealing with. There was a lot more similarities despite our political geography lines drawn. You know, it's like we were Georgia and we thought Alabama was terrible. But when you think about it, it's like, it's just ground and we're covering the same issues, you know. Well, this was actually just part one of the book. So there's a whole second part. And I think one takeaway I come away with this just right now is just, this wasn't a book about theology, but it was very applicable to theology. But also, how many times in this conversation did the relationship between self, neighbor, and God come up? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just us making those connections. It was like actually in his writing. Yeah. So it's just interesting.
Yeah. And I think this is, I know from reading a lot of liberation theologians and liberation ethicists, they make these connections because they're like, no, the economy and the government, it really does affect religion in so many ways that a lot of times sort of white privileged people try to make that separation of church and state. But when you are under the thumb of oppression, it all weaves together. And yeah, and so for me, I'm like, no, this is absolutely connected to religion. Because yeah, how these market economies devalue people. Well, the people who usually get devalued at this are usually minorities and women. And so I think that absolutely is connected to self and neighbor and to God.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.